We like to say the truth matters, but only if you hear it. Yet what millions of Americans are hearing every day comes from sources that are misleading or even deliberately spreading disinformation. WNYC's Divided Dial podcast takes a deep dive into one such source, radio giant Salem Media.
But for all of Salem's varied media strategies, broadcast radio is still central to their operations. According to Nielsen, broadcast radio has a higher reach than television. Pew Research says it's nearly neck and neck with social media for how Americans get their news. Surveys repeatedly show that Americans trust radio over any other medium.
So why is it such a big force? And what is Salem Media? The New York Times characterizes the content like this, quote, nationally syndicated radio shows that discuss baseless claims of rigged voting machines, accuse election officials of corruption, and expose ballot fraud conspiracy theories. Sounds pretty good, huh? No. So let's discuss with Katie Thornton, the host of The Divided Dial, a podcast series from WNYC's On the Media, and my dear friend Charlie Sykes, editor-at-large of The Bulwark and an MSNBC political analyst and former conservative radio host. Katie, let's start with you. How widely does Salem spread this kind of potentially really harmful misinformation?
You know, in the podcast series, we call Salem Media possibly the most influential media group you've never heard of. Salem is not the biggest radio station owner in the country by any means. They own just over 100 stations, but they syndicate to about 3,000 other stations. So while most of their station holdings are in sort of the major markets, covering a lot of the American cities and the suburbs, therefore reaching a lot of people, their programs are also heard in everywhere from the smallest towns to mid-sized cities. New York City has two Salem stations. Where I live in Minneapolis, I can pick up 4 Salem stations. So this has a really, really large reach on AM and FM radio.
Charlie, you know this space so well. You were a longtime radio host.
Yeah.
None of it's new, right? Rush Limbaugh was the king of this kind of misinformation for decades. But for many of those decades, yes, he was the only one out there doing it. Why has it gotten so much worse? Because there's so many Rush Juniors out there?
Yeah, there's a little bit room in the space, you know, and Salem is a juggernaut, but it's also interesting to watch its transformation. It used to have hosts who were reasonable, thoughtful hosts like Michael Medved. Now they have people like Charlie Kirk and Seb Gorka. They still feature Hugh Hewitt, who continues to peddle misinformation. Dennis Prager has become more MAGA. You know, one of the things about radio is it's a very intimate medium. It actually has there's a different relationship between the hosts and the listener than you will find on television or social media, because you are in people's ears, you are in their lives, and therefore they do have that sort of credibility. So it is based on trust, and if that trust is abused aggressively, you get the kind of results that we're talking about tonight.
Katie, talk about how available it is in some markets. In some markets, it's as though Salem is the only thing out there in terms of talk radio.
Yeah, you know, I think that Salem's reach is really multifaceted, because in a single market, you can have, 5, 6 Salem stations. As I said, where I live in Minneapolis, I can pick up 4 different Salem stations. But something else that's interesting about Salem is that they are a multimedia company. Their bread and butter is really this AM, FM talk radio. And they actually have a very interesting model, because in addition to being a conservative talk radio company, they have a lot of Christian teach and talk stations as well. They build themselves as the country's largest Christian conservative media, multimedia company. And what they do is they have these Christian teach and talk stations, which is sort of promoting what they call biblical values. And they use these stations as a way to sort of fund a lot of the rest of their radio operation. About 50% of, I believe, of their radio income comes from these paid ministries, these programs that come back year after year, even 95% of them return year after year, even across rate increases. And so this kind of buffers the rest of the Salem stations from some of the whims of advertisers, even from listener preference. And so it means that their radio market is just a bit more secure, because they have this strong financial base from their Christian teach and talk stations. In that case, then they can put on some of these more extreme voices, as Charlie mentioned, without necessarily having to be so afraid of something like an ad boycott, for example.
Charlie, we got a great example today of how extremism sells. Likely presidential wannabe hopeful Mike Pompeo. He called Randi Weingarten, head of the largest teachers union, the, quote, the most dangerous person in the world. Not Vladimir Putin, not Kim Jong-un, not Bashar al-Assad. Right. Nope, a teacher. How did we get here?
You know, that's such an interesting question because Mike Pompeo, knows the world, right? He's a sophisticated guy. He's one of the more normal Republicans. And, he volunteers. Who is the most dangerous person in the world? And you've run through this. So Mike Pompeo knows the Taliban. He knows Vladimir Putin. He knows President Xi. He knows the remnants of ISIS. He knows all of these folks. He knows Elon Musk. And yet he decides that the head of the teachers union is the name that he's going to throw out in this interview. And that's just an indication of the way that he knows what culture war button to push. And I will tell you that the vast majority of Americans do not know who Randi Weingarten is. When they wouldn't recognize her. But, in this world, to basically say, I am the enemy of these left-wing teachers unions, this is a signal to that core audience that I am one of you and I'm going to play all of the greatest hits of the culture war. And that's what Mike Pompeo is doing, even though it is utterly clownish to say that the most dangerous person in the world is the head of the teachers union, whatever you think about the teachers unions.
Charlie, did I just hear you say that Mike Pompeo was one of the more normal Republicans? Did I hear that correctly?
It's a low bar. Yes, when you look at the freak show that the Republican Party has got, when you have a continuum that includes Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz, Mike Pompeo would be one of the more normal Republicans. But as a normal Republican, he's got to show that he's willing to play this game. He's willing to be the longtime listener, first-time caller to all of the shows on places like Salem Radio and say, hey, I'm one of you. I hate the same people you hate. I am willing to attack the same people you dislike. That's what this is all about.
Mike Pompeo, former Secretary of State to Donald Trump.
Right.
I'm going to leave that there, Charlie. Katie Thornton, Charlie Sykes, more normal.